London, 1861, the richest city on earth. While American soldiers were dying at Bull Run and Shiloh, a very different war was being fought in the marble halls of British banking houses. A war fought not with rifles, but with ledgers. Not with cannons, but with credit. In this war, the Confederacy was fighting for its life. But they had one weapon no one else had: cotton. King Cotton. The raw material that powered the textile mills of Britain and France. The South believed that cotton would force Europe to recognize them. They believed that without their cotton, the British economy would collapse. They were wrong. Enter the bankers of London. The Baring brothers. One of the most powerful financial dynasties in history. They were the Rothschilds of the English-speaking world. And they were about to play the most dangerous game of their careers. They would lend money to the Confederacy. They would lend money to the Union. They would bet on both sides of the war, ensuring that no matter who won, they would collect the check. But they weren't alone. The great European banking houses, the Rothschilds in Paris and Frankfurt, the Barings in London, were all watching. And they all saw an opportunity. By the end of the Civil War, these bankers would have made more money from American blood than any general in history. This is the true story of the financial war behind the Civil War. To understand this story, we must first meet the man who orchestrated the South's financial strategy, Judah P. Benjamin. Benjamin was the Confederacy's Secretary of State. He was also its Secretary of War. And before that, he was a U.S. Senator from Louisiana. He was Jewish, brilliant, and ruthless. He was also a former slave owner who believed in the Confederacy with religious fervor. Benjamin's plan was simple. The South produced 75% of the world's cotton. Britain and France needed that cotton for their textile mills. Without it, their factories would close, and their workers would starve. So, Benjamin would use cotton as diplomatic leverage. He would persuade Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy as a legitimate nation. And once they did, they would send warships and soldiers to break the Union blockade. But there was a problem. The Union Navy was choking the southern coast. Blockade runners, fast, stealthy ships, were the only way to get cotton out and weapons in. Benjamin needed to turn cotton into gold. And to turn cotton into gold, he needed bankers. He needed someone in London who could sell Confederate bonds to European investors. He needed the Barings. Thomas Baring was the head of Barings Bank in London. He was cautious, conservative, and deeply religious. He did not like slavery. He did not like the Confederacy. But he loved money. And the Confederacy was offering him an incredible deal: bonds backed by cotton. Confederate bonds secured by Southern cotton stored in warehouses in Britain. If the Confederacy lost, Baring could just seize the cotton and sell it. He couldn't lose. But there was another player in this financial chess game: the British government. And the British government was officially neutral. In 1862, a crisis erupted. The British ship HMS Erskine was preparing to sail to the Confederacy with a massive shipment of weapons and military supplies. The Union ambassador, Charles Francis Adams, discovered the plot. Adams was furious. He demanded the British government stop the ship. Adams was no fool. He understood that if Britain officially recognized the Confederacy, it would be a disaster for the Union. But he also understood something else: money. Adams threatened the British government. He threatened to release all of Britain's war debts to the Union. The British government owed American banks hundreds of millions of dollars. If Adams exposed those debts, the British financial system could collapse. The British Parliament was thrown into chaos. Lord Palmerston, the Prime Minister, was furious. He wanted to recognize the Confederacy. But the bankers of London, the Barings, the Rothschilds, were terrified. They knew that if the Union collapsed, America would default on its debts. And European bankers held billions of dollars in American bonds. So, the bankers made a decision. They would quietly sabotage the Confederacy. The Barings refused to underwrite the Confederate bonds. They told Benjamin and the Confederate delegation that the risks were too high. They quietly leaked information to the Union about Confederate financial operations. The Erskine was stopped. The weapons never reached the Confederacy. And the European investment in the South dried up. Benjamin was desperate. He tried to sell Confederate bonds in France. He tried to sell them in the Netherlands. But the word had spread, the Confederacy was a bad investment. By 1863, the Confederate dollar had collapsed. Inflation in the South was out of control. A pound of beef that cost 10 cents in 1861 cost $10 in 1864. Southerners were starving while bankers in London grew rich. The bankers of London had made their fortune. They had lent money to the Union, and they had collected their interest. They had secretly supported the Confederacy, and they had collected their cotton. They had played both sides and won. The Confederacy was bankrupt. They couldn't pay their soldiers. They couldn't buy weapons. They couldn't even feed their people. The financial war was over, and the Confederacy had lost. In April 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox. The Confederacy was dead. And so was Judah P. Benjamin. Benjamin fled to Britain. He lived in London and Paris for the rest of his life. He became a successful lawyer. He died in 1884, never returning to America. So, who really won the Civil War? On the surface, the Union won. Slavery was abolished. The nation was preserved. But the bankers of London, they won too. The Barings, the Rothschilds, the European bondholders, they made billions from the American war. They lent money to both sides. They collected interest from both sides. They never lost a single penny. In fact, the Civil War was a financial windfall for Britain. While America was destroying itself, Britain was industrializing. The textile mills of Manchester and Liverpool were running at full capacity. British banks were expanding across the globe. The money that flowed into Britain from the American War helped fuel the British Empire for another 50 years. Judah P. Benjamin never expressed regret. In his memoirs, he wrote that the South fought for its rights. He insisted that slavery was not the cause of the war, but states' rights. Historians disagree. But one thing is certain: Benjamin was a brilliant man who failed to understand that the world had changed. Cotton was no longer king. Money was. The Barings Bank survived until 1995, when it collapsed in a spectacular scandal. A rogue trader named Nick Leeson brought down the 233-year-old institution with a single reckless bet. But the lesson of the Civil War remains. When war breaks out, the bankers win. They don't care about ideals. They don't care about freedom. They care about profit. Today, the American Civil War is remembered as a fight for freedom and justice. And it was. But it was also a financial war. A war between bankers, speculators, and empires. A war where the true victors were not the soldiers on the battlefield, but the men in top hats, counting their gold in the banks of London. The British bankers who bankrolled both sides of the Civil War didn't care about the cause. They cared about the coin. And they made a fortune from American blood.